Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jonathan Nashell. I'm chair of the history department, and we are very lucky for tonight's event. First of all, many people made tonight's event possible. First, I'd like to thank the following departments for their generosity. This includes English, history, political science, philosophy, psychology, the liberal studies program, sociology and anthropology, women's and gender studies, the Civil Rights Heritage Center, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. In other words, a whole lot of departments made this event possible, and I'm very grateful for that. This event is also part of the Kurt and Tessa Simon Lecture Series, and I'd like to acknowledge them for their generosity as well. Finally, I'd like to thank Lee Kahn, Associate Dean of the College, for his artistic talents in publicizing this event, his patience, and most importantly, his good humor. If you become an administrator, humor is very important. Chris Lehmann is one of our most important and prolific public intellectuals. He's editor-in-chief. Chris, that was not helpful. He's editor-in-chief of The Baffler, of which you can pick up a copy on your way out. I particularly recommend you go to page 104 and read his most recent, how should we say this, about the evil of tidying up. He's editor-in-chief, as I said, of The Baffler, a one-of-a-kind journal that investigates, actually it eviscerates, our modern world. He writes a column for them too, along with one for In These Times, just in case you'd like a little bit of socialist perspective on our world today. He also writes in a host of other venues, including this week's Nation, where he reviewed 5 books about Donald Trump. And if that is not the definition of masochism, if that weren't enough, he has a particularly brutal Twitter feed. During the presidential debate last week, Chris tweeted about Donald Trump, "Dude, you don't trash Rosie O'Donnell on Long Island." This is someone from New Jersey. I really enjoyed that one. Thomas Frank, our upcoming Bender Series lecturer, and he will be here October 22nd, and I hope you will all attend that as well, has said this about Chris's new book, The Money Cult, of which you can buy a copy and get it signed afterwards. Chris Lehmann is your tour guide on a startling journey through the Protestant past. After providing heaps of stomach-turning evidence, he reaches a shocking conclusion that old-time religion we hanker to get back to is just the Church of Mammon. We've been confusing God and the market all along. I must say that after reading Chris's remarkable book, I think it's safe to say that Chris won't be receiving a Christmas card from Joel Osteen anytime soon. Chris details how Osteen is much more than just another successful American televangelist. He's a pastor to the largest church in our country. Thanks to Osteen's constant presence on cable TV, Sirius XM, the web, numerous books and CDs, he has millions of loyal followers who in turn send their millions to him. And if by some small miracle Chris does receive a Christmas card from Mr. Osteen, I'm wagering it will have an envelope tucked inside it asking for a donation. His book charts Osteen's theology of abundance, a theology that has a rich, long history in America's past. His work reads then like a secret history of our country, one that is in plain view, a history that links Christianity and capitalism in wholly unexpected ways. Tonight, we have all invited Chris to speak about this money cult thing and help explain to us our present social condition, namely Donald Trump. Won't you all please welcome Chris Lehmann.
Thank you so much for coming out. Can you hear this?
Yes.
Good. First, I have to correct that introduction. Not only am I not a significant public intellectual, but I do regularly receive correspondence from the Joel Osteen ministry. And yes, he does solicit me for money. He also, because we live in this marvelous digital age, get phone messages, and once, shortly after the book was published and reviewed and got a little attention, this is, also the sumptuous digital age we live in is also a carnival of scammery. So I get I pick up my phone and a voice says, "Hold for Joel Osteen." And I have this moment of panic, like, somehow he's gotten wind of my work and is gonna pronounce damnation on me. But of course, it was just another robocall donation appeal. So, which is kind of appropriate because that is in miniature the story of Protestantism in America. It begins in hellfire, righteousness, and damnation, and ends with a fundraising appeal. But as Jonathan said, that's not why I'm here tonight. I'm here as countless other people who live in Washington are desperately trying to do to explain the phenomenon of the Donald Trump candidacy. For traditional analysts and commentators in the city I live in, Donald Trump is sort of a black box of political causation gone wrong, or if you prefer, an orange box. This is a conservative candidate who's casually trashed the Republican Party's century-and-a-half-long commitment to free trade. I will say, as a social liberal, or a welfare state liberal myself, I've been stunned to see that he delivers robust defenses of Social Security and Medicare, which is something no successful contemporary Republican presidential candidate has done ever, I think. His, let's say, colorful and erratic political past includes prior defenses of women's reproductive freedom and gay marriage. These are things he has had to pivot on to get the GOP nomination. You can do social welfare stuff, but as I think my talk will go on to illustrate, you don't screw with the evangelicals. So a year or so into the successful Trump takeover of the American Republican Party, our pundit class remains at a near complete loss when it comes to accounting for just how all this has happened and why it should be happening now. So I would like to take a little piece of the Trump phenomenon and examine one of the truly great mysteries that continues to generate pundit confusion. How has someone like Donald Trump, who is a twice divorced former casino baron, who resembles nothing so much as a Roman emperor at poolside, pulling such strong support among stout, hardcore, true-believing evangelical Christians? Recent polls are showing that Trump now is clocking more than 90% of the evangelical votes. Again, a really striking showing for someone who has defended Planned Parenthood and who has represented, as Ted Cruz famously said, New York values. And just, this is the world we're living in now. Just in today's news cycle alone, right? Donald Trump had a meeting of 70 sort of prosperity gospel pastors in Nevada. He visited a first grade or a primary Christian academy. Meanwhile, CNN uncovered 2 more Playboy tapes in which Donald Trump is featured. So it's like Jerry Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, is not only spinning in his grave, he's kind of spinning into Larry Flint's grave. Though technically Larry Flint is still alive, I just had to make that joke work somehow. So various explanations have been floated for this odd alliance of the evangelical right and a louche, debt-ridden billionaire real estate mogul. So-called value voters, some people theorize, share an authoritarian character structure. So they find a strongman figure like Trump reassuring, no matter how unchristian his temperament may be or his conduct is. Other pundits suggest that the traditional culture war crusades that have fueled, Republican election cycles for the past 40 years or so are losing their traction. Issues like gay marriage and the defense of the traditional family don't motivate, especially younger voters, the way they have in the past. Some even argue that Trump, in psychological terms, offers the same basic appeal as the God of the Bible to Christian believers. He's imperious, driven by whim, and demanding of fierce, unquestioning loyalty, much like God. Again, just in today's news cycle, I came upon what I think is the most novel theological rationalization for the evangelical support for Trump. A pastor actually came forward with a kind of prophecy where he said, God is using Donald Trump to be elected president, then God will call him back, so Mike Pence will be the tribune of the Lord's will. So who's your pride? However, from the vantage point of my book, $28 in the lobby, speaking of the money cult, the seeming paradox of the evangelical right's failure to reject someone like Trump isn't really a paradox at all. I argue that we kind of are looking at this question from the wrong end of the telescope, that it's not so much that Donald Trump doesn't fit well with the traditional evangelical political agenda, it's that the evangelical Protestant world has come more and more over time to represent Donald Trump's world. What do I mean by this? Well, this is where the aforementioned Joel Osteen comes in. No figure, I think, is more important for explaining this seeming paradox than Osteen. He sort of bookends the story I tell in The Money Cult. The book actually opens with a description of a fundraising appeal, which makes me think that Jonathan hasn't read it at all. But you can skim, it's fine. But Joel Osteen and Donald Trump are actually old friends. Donald Trump was the first guest to appear on the initial broadcast of Osteen's Sirius XM radio show. And if you can look it up online if, like me, you're morbidly curious about this stuff, and it's obsequious. Like, if you want to hear a drawling pastor say, like, Donald Trump, you are godlike, this is your opportunity. More than that, though, both Osteen and Trump share kind of strikingly parallel biographical stories. They're both the younger sons of empire-building fathers who didn't initially expect all that much from them. And they both now preside over business fiefdoms that hinge on their own personal brands as the main proof text of their genius. So Osteen, in many ways, the reason I've used him to frame The Money Cult is he offers a dramatic conversion narrative that shows us how the older social contract of American Protestantism, which is based on incremental reform in the service of the Lord's will, has given way steadily to an intensely individualist, success-driven gospel. Both before and after the 2008 market crash, Osteen remains the nation's most popular, beloved, and successful pulpit orator. Like most preachers of today's prosperity gospel, Osteen comes out of the word of faith branch of Pentecostalism. This is I'll discuss it in a little more detail later, but it's basic teaching of word of faith preachers is that if you utter the right words out of Scripture, mainly, but also from success manuals, you will become rich, and your ascension to wealth is God's will. And Osteen, like most preachers, uses his autobiographical story to illustrate how this gospel works. Osteen's father, John, who was also a Word of Faith preacher, who bequeathed to his son the Lakewood congregation in Houston that Joel now presides over, was inspired by, direct instruction from God to forsake his roots and baptize himself in the fundamentals of spiritual-minded success. Joel Osteen recounts his dad's spiritual ascent in his breakout 2004 best-selling book, Your Best Life Now. And here I am going to do my Joel Osteen impression. I've worked on it on a lot of radio interviews, but I do want to apologize for any true Southerners in the audience. So Joel writes, "In the natural, my father had no future, no hope. But God is not limited by environment, family background, or present circumstances. God doesn't get stuck in the rut of defeat and mediocrity. My dad refused to limit God. He believed that God had more in store for him. And because he stayed focused on that dream and was willing to step out in faith, because he was willing to go beyond the barriers of the past, he broke the curse of poverty for our family." Now, these kind of homilies strike many broad and familiar chords of recognition. Like I said, most preachers draw on their spiritual autobiography as kind of a proof text of their faith succeeding. Also, the notion of an unlimited God is very central to evangelical Protestant preaching. It reflects the idea of a creator for whom all things are possible, as Jesus says in Matthew 19:26. But I want to highlight one word that Joel uses in this homily and throughout his preaching, the curious phrase, the natural. His father had to overcome the obstacles he faced in the natural. This signifies the merely created obstacles to personal success. And it's a notion that places God emphatically beyond the reach of any kind of traditional social determinism. That's why he talks about God not being limited by environment, family background, or present circumstances. Now, this is in striking contrast to, say, the collective portrait of the divine patriarchy that emerges in the Hebrew Bible, where you have these long sort of genealogies proving that prophets and figures such as Jesus, can claim a parentage throughout history that justifies their mission. In contrast to that vision of how prophecy works, Joel Osteen celebrates a God who blithely clears away the limiting impersonal forces of the environment, history, and your upbringing, the stuff of the natural. So it stands to reason that Joel Osteen's own model patriarch, his father, exemplified this faith by a steadfast willingness to go beyond the barriers of the past, and that this was the bold act that proved his sort of conversion moment to the gospel of success. Now, the divine power that conquers the natural is, of course, the realm of the supernatural, and this is where, in the Joel Osteen success gospel, things get weird. The fundamental spiritual plight that Osteen is describing in his preaching and his books is that of a defeatist soul, someone who's been beaten down by life, who isn't getting ahead in their career or family life. And they've perversely denied themselves the vision of success that God has cleared for them, the same way that God did it for Joel Osteen's dad. This sort of ideal type of the prosperity gospel believer, not surprisingly, tracks the demographic profile of Osteen's own congregation in Lakewood. That is to say, these are anxious members of the upward-striving managerial class who are wrestling with debt, domestic conflicts, professional challenges, or flagging self-esteem. Now, the good news that Osteen preaches to this audience is that God is closely tracking their trials, and he's employing the mechanisms of consumer capitalism to engineer their own redemption, their own just storehouse of worldly yet supernaturally delivered reward. To hear Osteen preach or to read any of his confessional self-help books, there are about 15 at this point, I think, all bestsellers, is to encounter, I argue, the purest form of the American religion of the imperial self. Across the many anecdotes and homilies that Osteen is preaching, God is given the kind of monotonous mission of over and over again, awakening the lagged ranks of believers to the good news that they are destined to be rich and to succeed. Indeed, one of his favorite biblical paraphrases in all of his work is the notion that Christian believers are destined to be more than conquerors. And there's another homily from the Osteen family story that Joel uses to illustrate the advantages of a prosperous mindset, as he calls it. This is another episode from early in his father's ministry where the family was just barely getting by financially, and his parents wound up taking on a boarder who was another minister, and it stretched the family budget even further. And a wealthy businessman in the congregation gave Osteen's dad a check for $1,000. And this was in the 1960s, where $1,000 was kind of real money. But this was when John Osteen was still in the poverty mindset. And as a good Christian pastor, he turned this windfall over to his church instead of giving it to his family. The moral of the story for both the elder Osteen and for the son is obvious. Dad had later said, with every step I took as I walked to the front of the church to put that check in the offering, something inside me was saying, don't do it. Receive God's blessings. Receive God's goodness. But he didn't listen. He reluctantly dropped the check into the offering. He later said, when I did, I felt sick to my stomach. God was trying to increase my dad. He was trying to prosper him. But because of Dad's deeply embedded poverty mentality, he couldn't receive it. God was trying to get him to step up to the banquet table. But because of Dad's limited mindset, he couldn't see himself having an extra $1,000. Or if we were to translate this into the rhetoric of evangelical darling Donald Trump, it would go something like, John Osteen couldn't, I can't do a Donald Trump, sorry. John Osteen couldn't let God lift him up from loserdom. Sad. But again, as with all Protestant preaching, this homily is ultimately an inspirational story of personal conquest. And so it has a happy ending. Once John Osteen set aside the pinched poverty mindset he had inherited, God took control, and the Osteen clan was launched in the true American creed of material wealth. Now, several themes are striking for me in this folksy homily. It is, to begin with, a seamless leap for Osteen and other preachers in the prosperity gospel tradition to discern the divine will in a windfall of cash. And what's interesting to me about that is none of these preachers reckon with the flip side of that notion, namely that if God is rewarding his true believers with wealth, he must be punishing the people who are poor, who are, in the poverty mindset, who are deficient, who are not attuned to the divine will. The curious thing about this conception of human agency in the capitalist scheme of salvation is that for all the weird, careful attention that God is lavishing on mundane financial, commercial transactions and the like, God is also almost entirely blameless for hard times. And it's true, like, the prosperity gospel was not affected in any significant way by the 2008 meltdown. It's kind of unprecedented in modern Protestant history that, there isn't some sort of social justice response to a mammoth economic downturn like that. But here we are. Economic fortune in this crudely foreshortened moral economy is a pure function of rousing believers to accept the supernatural gifts of grace, a bona fide awakening into the unconditional, abundant realm of what earlier prophets of American Protestant money faith called the higher self. Then, too, in this image of Osteen's dad sickened by his charity, there's the idea that God is seeking to elect gratitude and reverence through, he's using money to stir people to reverence and belief. It's an invitation, as Osteen says, to a banquet table that is perversely shunted away by the poverty mentality. For all the historical forces that have bound together Protestant faith and American capitalism, few preachers of the success gospel have actually been bold enough to cite the random fortunes allotted by the money culture as an ironclad expression of God's will. Osteen's family parable, like most of his other inspirational preaching, is there to essentially refute the claim that God works in mysterious ways. God moves in ways that are clearly delineated and measured by the market. The only mystery, again, is why depressive or dull-witted captives of the poverty mentality are so slow to grasp this essential truth. And again, here it takes no great leap of the imagination to connect this view of the world with Donald Trump's. In each of these success gospels, Trump's and Osteen's, succumbing to the defeatist mindset of the natural, the merely created world, or if you prefer, the world of sad and broken losers, these people are resentful, they're self-undermining, they're failures, they're losers, again, as Trump would say. So this, I speak of the God of the market not just as a metaphor, like Osteen is very thorough in his preaching and showing how the divine will exhibits itself in everyday financial transactions. There's a, and this is why it's outlandish to me that the '08 meltdown has had no impact on his preaching. He actually has written about God instructing him to flip his house in 2006 to get a windfall return because he was unwittingly purchased this new property in a commercially zoned, rapidly developing neighborhood in Houston, and praise the Lord. It's not just a metaphor for this guy. God is the moral engine behind American capitalism. And so, likewise, because Osteen is so attuned to the everyday anxieties and thwarted ambitions of his Lakewood congregation, he takes pains to spell out in very minute detail just how the divine will should guide you in things like keeping the interior of your car clean. He exhorts readers to start making more excellent choices in every area of life, even the mundane. He complains at length about the spiritual toll involved in driving a car that, as he puts it, looks like a storm hit on the inside. I don't like driving a car like that. Not only does it represent God poorly, but it makes me feel unkempt, undisciplined, sloppy, and less than my best. Many times before I leave the house, I'll take a couple of minutes and clean out the car, not because I want to impress my friends, but because I feel better driving a clean car. You need to take pride in what God has given you. So that's, Joel Osteen believes that God, a force even greater than Oprah Winfrey, has selected your car according to his will. And this same divine mysticism of small things applies to things like Joel Osteen's Dress for Success tips. You are made in the image of Almighty God, and how you present yourself in your personal appearance is not only a reflection of how you feel about yourself, it is a direct reflection of God. Osteen also reminds his Lakewood parishioners that they must always stand up straight and smile. And you certainly shouldn't, if you aspire to represent God as a person of excellence, lazily toss a discarded grocery store item on a random shelf in the wrong section. nor should you take a parking spot designated for the handicapped, or leave the lights on or air conditioner running in a hotel room you've recently checked out of. These are all affronts to God, I'm not kidding. And nor especially should you model followers of Christ be obdurate, lazy, or inefficient workers. In another parable of the divinely ordered economy, Osteen describes the spiritual awakening of a company manager in his Lakewood congregation. This is a person who got a better job at a rival company and found himself sort of blowing off, the routine task of the job he's about to leave. Here too, Osteen is very, very clear that the hand of God is hovering over this sad state of affairs. And this is Joel Osteen recounting the story of his parishioner. One day I went to work feeling kind of lazy, giving a half-hearted effort. And God spoke to me right down inside. He said, son, if you don't continue to honor this company by giving them your best effort, you're not going to excel at that new position. My friend realized who his real boss is. He was not working for his company or his supervisor. He was working unto God, not unto men. God is the one keeping the records. He's the one who will reward us. He's the one who can promote you. I don't think I'm going to get promoted. Meanwhile, for the office drones, people who are not, getting headhunter offers from rival firms, but are kind of feeling put upon and alienated with the monotony and drudgery of their lower stakes drudges in the corporate world, Osteen has considerably harsher advice. Here, he blithely takes up the self-improving, solidarity-averse maxims of the management-minded self-help movement. You need to change your attitude. You should be grateful that you even have a job. You need to appreciate and stay excited about the opportunities God has given you. If you work outside your home, don't give your employer a half-hearted effort. Don't dawdle on the telephone, wasting your employer's time and money. If you are digging a ditch, don't spend half the day leaning on your shovel. Do your work with excellence and enthusiasm. Now, obviously, it's easy to make sports of these kind of control freak maxims, even as they're attributed, especially as they're attributed to the author of Our Universe, who I would hope has better things to do than to micromanage the attitudes of individual office workers. But on one level, as I said, Osteen is quite serious about this, and why shouldn't he? His immensely popular and influential version of the success gospel speaks to real, ordinary fears and anxieties of a class of ordinary strivers who feel themselves on the perpetual brink of socioeconomic decline. For Osteen's parishioners, viewers, and readers, a smartly turned out appearance or a diligently organized workstation could mean the difference between a steady salary and an indefinite plunge into debt, unemployment, or depression. Or in the way that economic and personal misfortunes will often intertwine, it might mark the dividing line between a divorce and a marital reconciliation. These are the realms of American life where divine favor is often most desperately needed and just as desperately felt to be absent. There is, I would argue, in other words, a poignant quality to Osteen's efforts to baptize the workaday routines of family and office life into the divine image. Osteen's gospel expresses, just beneath its surface, an anxiety to appease an aggrieved and angry market god. Osteen's rage for personal order scarcely conceals the gnawing suspicion that the workings of the market and the entire system of reward and punishment that they rationalize are in fact deeply impersonal and indeed terrifyingly random. In this scheme of things, the only remedy at hand is the saving knowledge that the believer is actually in possession of a higher self, belonging to a realm beyond the flawed created order, and destined for a redemption that far outstrips the present worldly bonds of the natural. The market can only be subdued by the more than conquering spirit if the hated limitations and weaknesses of the natural are dispelled once and for all. Now, there's another key word of faith doctrine that readily explains, I think, its appeal and certainly its name. The notion known as name it and claim it, which is the rare theological doctrine that actually means what it says. This is the idea that the words believers utter have a mystic power to shape their destinies. If believers let themselves speak words of defeat, despair, or illness, they will typically, as this tradition teaches, succumb to failure, despair, or debilitating sickness. And if, on the other hand, believers intone words of victory, success, and wealth, they will flourish, conquer, and prosper. There is a miracle in your mouth, Osteen exhorts. When times get tough, don't give in to murmuring, disputing, and complaining. Speak to those problems. If you learn how to speak the right words and keep the right attitude, God will turn that situation around. Now, in the context of this name it and claim it doctrine, I think it's well worth noting that the rhetoric of Trumpism functions in pretty much the same way. The totems of the Donald Trump faith are things like a giant wall around the American southern border, or the incantation of a lost American greatness that's going to be reclaimed, or the promise of renegotiated trade deals with China and Europe. These central themes of the Trump movement have once more baffled the Washington pundit class, which consistently mistakes them for policy pronouncements. In reality, I would argue these too are name it and claim it talismans of faith. It doesn't matter in this sphere of spiritual discourse that Mexico will not, in fact, ever pay for the erection of a giant wall. What matters is the miracle in Donald Trump's mouth, as he calls out for his own parishioners to shout that wish fulfillment fantasy along with him. What matters isn't so much that Trump opposed the 2003 invasion of Iraq, he didn't, but that his followers need him to be the kind of retroactive prophet who could have. Nor should we hasten to add, is this particular brand of magical thinking so very exotic or strange as it gets applied to our broader economic life? Stripped of their religious language, Osteen's name it and claim it reveries of overnight fortune are no different in substance from the vast bubble-driven body of policymaking and economic thought that continues to dictate the terms of debate in our country. When Alan Greenspan famously pronounced that there could not be a crash in the national housing market, he was only offering an Ayn Rand gloss on Osteen's confident surmise that God was directing him to flip his Houston townhouse. When Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, assured a British financial journalist that his investment bank was doing the Lord's work by directing capital into the most productive sectors of the American economy, he too was voicing a faith no more substantial in its concrete particulars than the assurances of material victory thundering down from the pulpits of the prosperity gospel. When Mitt Romney inveighed on the stump in 2012 against government handouts while championing the financial mandate to slash government spending in the troughs of a historic global recession, he also was merely touting the conservative movement's pet variation of the name it and claim it faith. In this curious, irrational mode of policy prophecy, citizens are ultimately to be granted true and lasting good fortune via the spiritual war that the American right has been waging against the hateful idea of a functioning public sector. And it does follow, even if it's not stated aloud, that the layabout beneficiaries of public spending will be, in this grander scheme of things, assailed with punitive austerity, when the welfare state's marginal expansion is exposed as a dire moral folly. In other words, and here I'll wrap up, I think it's a categorical error to view the Trump and Osteen visions of personal salvation as somehow fringe, out there, outlier version or features of American life. The rhetoric of the prosperity gospel is increasingly the taken for granted ideological orientation of our common world. And I think that's why we're likely to see, regardless of the outcome of the pending election, many other strange signs and wonders after Donald Trump. So, thank you.
Donald Trump is a complicated individual.
I like to think so, but I think that's just because I had to read 5 goddamn books about him.
You kids, you can check out his book reviews. We have time for some questions. Would anyone like to ask a question about this relationship between Donald Trump, who's kind of like the urtext of modern capitalism, and Joel Osteen? Yes, April.
So this is very interesting and horrifying, so thank you.
That's what I love.
So one of the unspoken threads in here, and maybe it was unspoken because it's looming everywhere, is the patriarchy. So I wonder if you could say just a little bit about the gender thread that goes through here.
That's a really good question. As I was explaining, Joel Osteen's own sort of creation myth is a story of a patriarchy, of a legacy handed down.
No vagina.
Yeah, and there are, I'm forgetting her name now, but there is a Florida prosperity gospel preacher who allegedly presided over Donald Trump's alleged conversion to evangelical Christianity. Do you know her name? No, it's a woman. I'm just blanking on her name. So there are women in the movement, but it is, I think it's fair to say, all of this life advice that Joel Osteen extends is obviously aimed at a male reader. His wife is also a preacher and accompanies him on revival tours, and I think this is sort of the answer. She has her own line of sermons and DVDs and books about the women's role in the prosperity gospel, which turns out, surprise, surprise, to be a helpmeet and to shore up your, man as he sort of absorbs the blows of the market. Thank you.
I wonder if you could speak to the way in which usually when we talk about the draw of American evangelicals to the conservative movement, or in this case to Trump, what often goes kind of quietly unspoken is white evangelical. And given the extraordinary growth or a draw to Hispanics, to the evangelical faith, away from Catholicism, the strength of African Americans within the evangelical movement, and kind of the lack of draw, at least to Donald Trump. But I'm not sure in terms of the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, the 70 pastors I mentioned that he met with in Nevada were overwhelmingly African American. There is a very strong, Creflo Dollar is a perfect example, African American presence in the prosperity gospel. And that's an interesting story. The Pentecostal movement that gave birth to the prosperity gospel began as a largely disenfranchised African American revival movement in the American South and the West. And yes, it becomes wider, it becomes a businessman's faith, and it, but there is still, and Osteen's own congregation is pretty integrated, and I think that's one of the reasons he hasn't actually endorsed Trump. He has a lot of Hispanic parishioners that would not go over with, I would guess. But yeah, it is, I think, there's a larger failure since the Civil Rights era of mainline American Protestantism to preach an integrated gospel of social justice. And I could only speculate on the deep, what you're referring to as the deeper undercurrents behind that. Well, go left to right, I guess.
The story about his father is interesting because it would just be one little tiny step further to say, God told me to steal the money.
Right. Right. No, that is exactly true. That is, as I was sort of indicating, there's no the divine accounting in the ledger of the prosperity gospel, I mean, it doesn't account for evil or sin or traditional kind of Calvinist teachings, but it also doesn't account for, you know, in very, very many cases, I think we should have learned in the wake of the '08 debacle, the fortunes of people who manipulate financial instruments come directly from the well-being of middle-class, working-class Americans. The prosperity gospel kind of exists to repress all that. And it's remarkably successful. Yeah.
Where's Ted Cruz fit in all this? Because he's in that same neck of the woods as...
Yeah. And his dad is a evangelical pastor who's in the Reconstructionist tradition, which is sort of much more hardcore, and they regard the Joel Osteens, because Joel Osteen will soft pedal sin and suffering. A lot of traditional evangelicals regard Joel Osteen as close to a blasphemer. So I don't want to give a distorted picture of the theology here. It is unorthodox in that way, but it is enormously much more influential than Reconstructionism. And yeah, Ted Cruz himself, was Trump's, it was in Indiana that Ted Cruz mounted his last stand against Trump. And I think it's significant that he did so on the issue of transgender bathroom access, which is that is straight from the evangelical culture war playbook, and it did not work, obviously. I'm tempted to say that the evangelical culture wars ended not with a bang, but with a trickle. But never mind. We'll move on. Yes.
You discussed the religious teachings and education for evangelicals, but what about the secular education? What's the impact on the Allure of Trump in that retrospect?
I'm sorry, I just didn't hear the last part of that question.
So you talk about the religious teachings and the education part within the church, but how does secular education impact the Allure of Trump? Does it take away from it, or does it add to it?
That's also a good question. I think what surprised many people is, if anyone is sort of an incarnation, if you will, of a secular pleasure-loving mentality, it's Donald Trump, right? He's in Playboy videos, for God's sakes. So I think, far be it from me to be cynical, but I think, as I was suggesting with his reversals on issues like women's reproductive rights and gay marriage, he's made the calculation he really needs, and it's true, that's why this late in the election he's still going to Christian schools and courting prosperity pastors. This is like the firewall. And I also read recently, like a lot of people worried about the election, I obsessively follow poll sites, and Trump is comfortably ahead still in Ohio, which is a key swing state, and Hillary is just as comfortably ahead in Pennsylvania, which is another key swing state. And the analysis I was reading suggested that, the basic reason for this gap is that the evangelical vote in Cincinnati is roughly 27%, and in Philadelphia it's 6%. So we are at this inflection point, I think, where Trump just has to get every evangelical conservative out to the polls. So he is, I think, personally a very secular figure, though in this piece in The Nation that I just published, I argue that his most direct, the most important spiritual thinker in Trump's own development is Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. Donald Trump's family of origin worshipped at Peale's church in Manhattan. Peale presided over Trump's first marriage to Ivana Trump. And I don't have the energy to rehearse that whole piece, but it is in The Nation if you want to look it up.
I heard stated once that the post-Cold War discussion wasn't so much about Marx and Smith, but more about Nozick and Rawls.
Interesting, yeah.
The American evangelicals to Nozick. Was it just Cold War and Southern strategy stuff, like anti-racism? Like what? They're kind of pushed this. Individualists.
I'm sorry, you're asking whether American evangelicals have what their posture on foreign policy is in the post-Cold War?
How did American evangelicals begin to embrace individualism? It's like the core aspect of virtue.
That's a great, enormous question. And I mean, it was there at the creation, as it were, I think. I'm trying to think of a way to answer that question without giving you the entire complicated argument of my book. But I think, there's a tension, there's always been a tension in American Protestant belief between the idealized image of what's called the primitive church, that's what revivals are always about, bringing back the purest form of worship from the first century, basically, the age of Paul. During that time, the Christian church was essentially socialist. They shared property in common. Women had positions of spiritual authority, speaking of the patriarchy. So you have this sort of seed of faith, as it were, taking root in the New World, and then you have enormous material wealth. That is, and I think what happens over time is the market becomes sanctified, as Joel Osteen is kind of the end point of this process, I would suggest, that you look upon the, workings of capitalism as the divine will. And you go back to sermons by Jonathan Edwards, most famous theologian and best theologian in our tradition, and he says outright that God has blessed this nation with plenty. Joseph Smith, the most frequently intoned phrase in the Book of Mormon after and so it came to pass, which occurs constantly, but is essentially God rewards believers with money, with wealth. So it's there at the creation, and I would argue as the capitalist economy becomes more and more dominant, you have the consumer capitalist version of the Osteen faith.
So the moral outgrowth of late stage capitalism.
Yeah, if you want to, yeah. Here?
So if I understood you correctly, you're suggesting that the evangelicals are moving closer to Trump's mentality, right, is what you're saying. But my question is there something in your mind or your theory, your book, that would explain their willingness to ignore his obvious lacks of facts or his flip-flop nature?
As I was saying, I think that's a name it and claim it idea. Okay. And that's also part of the Norman Vincent Peale preaching is you literally sort of chant in your head mantras of success and they come true. And so I think at some level, you either have the position that Donald Trump is kind of a sociopathic liar or that he believes this stuff, and there's remarkable, if you look up a deposition he had when he sued a journalist for the sin of confirming that he was not in fact a billionaire. He basically says, well, I feel like a billionaire, so therefore I am. And I think that explains a lot. And I think it's also why it doesn't jar, because you would think religious people place value on truth. It's a different kind of truth, I think, in this game. You've been raising your hand, sorry.
How do you think Pence and his supposedly strong faith fits into Trump's rhetoric, especially with evangelical voters?
I think it's very reassuring. That's why this pastor today came out and said, essentially, God's going to elect Donald Trump, kill him, bring Mike Pence. Not the God I worship, I will say. But yeah, Pence is really important, and I think you saw in last night's debate, I would suggest, the beginnings of the Mike Pence 2020 candidacy, and it's going to be firmly grounded in evangelical thinking and rhetoric, which, as you know, is the person who gave Indiana this amazing defense of marriage law and commands burials for aborted fetuses like this is, he is in fact a true believer, and he's pretty well positioned.
Quite obviously, that's not a bad parallel between Osteen and Trump being both fanatical and like they're unethical, perhaps, fraudulent, and like that. So, if we're going to get to what Trump's religion is, I think you said you really didn't know what his exact.
No, he's a Presbyterian, technically. What? Presbyterian.
Okay, all right.
I don't know the last time he went to church, but he, like I said, the thinker the religious thinker who's most influential, he's said over and over again, is Norman Vincent Peale, who's actually a reform minister, which is a very theologically kind of liberal tradition, which I think makes Trump's life less complicated, but mainly is another, arguably the most important apostle of the gospel of success. He, like I said, he has a very mechanistic scheme of you just repeat these kind of mantras that you will prosper and succeed and they will come to pass. Did you have a question? Oh, no, sorry, I thought you were using your... Oh, we have one more back here.
So how do you, I see the connection you're drawing between sort of prosperity, there's a similar logic in the prosperity gospel in the way Trump operates. How do you account for other evangelicals outside the scope of the prosperity gospel?
That's a good question. I mean, the Supreme Court is huge. There's the belief that, you have to prevent a Democrat from appointing a justice who might support abortion rights. And also the sheer, there's been a generation's worth of rhetoric on the American right devoted to demonizing, and I mean that quite literally, Hillary Clinton. There are now posters at Trump rallies that depict Hillary as the devil. So I think those forces combined with this idea, but it is striking that, Trump is not being called on as many ethical lapses, that in fact his enormous wealth, however, whether it truly is in the billions, is a credential for these people, and it's striking. Anyone else? Oh, I guess I'm being cut off.
Well, you're going to be cut off here in a second. First of all, everyone, a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
So two things. A, you have thoroughly impressed me, so thank you for that. And B,
what I'm here for.
If you would like to continue this conversation, that'd be great. Chris will be happy to sign copies of his book.
Once you buy them.
Please pick up copies of The Battler if you have not. It is a one-of-a-kind journal, and I must tell you that there is a piece in there, every single issue, that makes me laugh out loud, and another that makes me cry. So it is quite an unusual journal. And the history department, because we have no end of splendor. We have pens and pencils out there. So please make sure, go crazy, take a pen or pencil. Okay, you guys, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.